Good afternoon, everyone. Great pleasure to be here, and I would like first to thank the organizer for such an inspiring and well-organized event, and also such an engaging audience. The first time I came to Korea was about 25 years ago. I was a PhD student in artificial intelligence, and I was, having a conference at KAIST, and working back then on natural language processing, and we heard quite a lot about the things in the last 2 days. Since then, just to understand from where I speak, basically, I'm just going to talk to you a bit more about my journey since. And, we are going to hear, and it's very good that in the last session, I didn't expect it actually, that we had such an introduction of topics of climate change. I mean, obviously, I know that blockchain technologies are very much into that space. So, from artificial intelligence and the natural language processing, I moved first, I would say, even in the more invisible. In the sense, I worked on a number of projects on what we call artificial cells and programmable artificial cells, which is really working basically at the atomic or at the protocell level. And basically the idea was to create artificial cells which were mimicking natural cells, but trying to give them the properties of the natural cells, which is basically self-healing, self-repairing, evolution. And basically the vision back then, which is actually still around in some of the applications, was, for example, to say, well, these kind of artificial cells, you can take them and program them in a way where you go and see an oil spill somewhere in the ocean, and with that kind of, techniques, you can go, well, obviously from the vision, I'm talking about 15-ish years ago. Still, I mean, it's still a long way to go. Interestingly enough, also, when you think about artificial intelligence, 25 years ago when I was doing my PhD, AI was supposed to solve everything, It did a lot of things, and again, you heard quite a lot in the last 2 days. But of course, there are also disappointment, and there are also kind of hype, Saved the world, solved everything. Then 10 years ago was a kind of, that's it, not more is happening with this. And then, the last 5, 7+ years, again, and again, obviously with the Internet of Things and with the blockchain and etc. So that's quite interesting to see how the things move. And again, one of the things, after this, the very invisible, what's happening at that level, what became kind of fashionable was what we call convergent technologies. Nano, bio, info, cogno. Cognitive, etc., and then BIC, convergence, and then with all the visions and speeches about transhumanism and beyond human and whatever, and enhanced human and what you can do in that space. So anyways, in terms of journey, I moved towards socioeconomic issues and mostly environmental issues and mostly climate change issues, climate policy. So today I'm a professor at the University of Oxford at the Environmental Change Institute, and also working with the Global Climate Forum. And the way I'm looking at the things, it's always in interactions in between what you can do to solve these issues with technology and science, from where I'm still using my background, first in physics and then in artificial intelligence, but also with things which are, very stakeholder-oriented and social science and political science-oriented. So most of my work, actually, it's always at the interface. Interface in between science and business, interface in between science and society, science and government, and all kind of, and also with a kind of multi-level approach, complex, looking at the multi-dimensional issues of things, and also with the forward-looking. And I mean, you can't look at climate change issues if you don't try to look into the forward perspective and also with the long-term perspective. So enough about me, but let's try to to see, to advance a bit, and obviously, how we can overcome climate change. If it was so simple, I would just say 42, and we are done. So basically, how I organize my talk today. First, where we stand. And as I said, the last session actually started a bit with some of the issues, but I would go a bit more, and how to solve the problems which are posed by climate change. And obviously, what I'm gonna look here mostly is technology. Technology, but not immediately technology. Technology in the broad sense, even some of the traditional technology, because, some of this technology which are around are very much useful to do that, and then I'm gonna move towards mostly the digital tech and particularly our artificial intelligence. And are they or are not game changer in climate change domain? And my argument is that technology is definitely not enough. That's, if there is one take-home message, I deliver it now, which is you need to change deep changes in the behavioral sense, in the sense of consumer behavior, business behavior, and governmental behavior. So all societal actors need actually to do this. And also, how do you basically avoid the risk of the technologies? And in the end, how do we move on with that? So, my starting point is, and this is probably a surprise for no one. There is a lot of fear, there is uncertainty around. When we talk about the future of the humanity, you heard the question we just posed to the previous panel from a student saying, with all this uncertainty around, what is the best way to train myself? I can give some hints to that student later on. But basically, this is there, and when we think about climate change, there are several ways. One way is we think about this, what I would call iconic species. I don't know how many of you in the room have seen penguins or polar bears in real life, except at the zoo. However, this is something I'm sure if I ask you all, everybody does care about penguins and polar bears, and we think the world would be a sadder place without the penguins and the polar bears. And it's true that the kind of picture, this is a picture which was taken in Antarctica not long ago, and you have several really big issues which are threatening the species. So iconic species, it's one way to look at climate change. Well, I have colleagues, environmental lawyers who are working for the defense of worms. Well, worms are not so glamorous, even if they are very important for the soil and for the nutrition and for the agriculture. However, it's much less glamorous, to convey the same kind of messages for this kind of, they're not iconic species. And I'm happy and I like polar bears and penguins, but of course the thing is much bigger than, that's, well, and you have cumulative evidence. This is a picture which was taken by scientific colleagues who are, this is in Iceland, and, well, the Iceland glaciers shrunk by basically 15% over the last 20 years. 15% over 20 years, it's very much. If you think of the geological scale, this is really, really worrying. So yeah, there are some really worrying messages there. So one way to look at climate change is this iconic species. Another way is, well, what does it do? And I'm sure you've seen many of this picture. The climate change is for the poor countries, or for the poor in our countries, in our developed countries. This is a picture which was, I'm sure you've seen tons of them. This comes from Bangladesh, which is, severely always flooded, and you have this kind of things. Here, another picture this is north of Pakistan. That region in Pakistan, because of the glaciers are melting and the lakes are becoming bigger, and the banks of the lakes are not solid enough, basically what you end up with is floods and landslides, and basically you had, in that tiny region, 8 bridges and very numerous roads which are broken. So basically you have isolated communities and all the things. And, again, That's again in Bangladesh. It used to be a river. It's not there, but I'm not going to comment more. What my point is, iconic species on one side, poor, the poor of the world, and there are many, even if there are less and less, but still. But, this kind of picture, this is a picture we took last year in South France. Well, it's a decently developed country, and however, in the last year, drought is being quite severe, and the reservoirs are getting really low levels of water. At the point that, for example, there are a couple of nuclear reactors in the power plants in France, which basically have to be shut down over several weeks, sometimes months, over the summer, just because we cannot run them safely in terms of cooling. So, well, this is becoming a kind of more developed country issues. I don't know if you've seen that in the news in the last weeks. This was what we call a hailstorm in Rome 3 weeks ago. In less than 3 hours, basically you had hill level and even knee level of hail all over and blocked completely the capital of Italy. And people start freaking out because they say, well, this is something we didn't expect and we don't really understand what's going on. So people start thinking about that kind of thing. So again, developed countries, they felt a kind of, we should do something about climate change impact because that's a kind of morality for the taking care of the poor. However, now people are saying, well, I better do that just because I'm in the same place, the same game too. I mean, in this country, you probably know quite a lot about transboundary pollution. Dust comes from time to time, even sometimes to Seoul, and so on. So that's, snapshots, events, which I'm talking about. But you have other phenomena which are less spectacular. But, they are there, and they are slow developing. However, they are there, and they are really happening. Lake Chad used to be in the 60s, still the 60s, the fourth biggest lake in Africa. That's a picture which was taken in '63. And then the pictures which come are basically taken every 10 years, more or less at the same time of the year, because you have a high seasonality, so if not, consistency would not be there. Well, to make the story short, that's how in over 40 years, basically, the lake shrunk by more than 90%. Well, part of it is climate change, part of it is not climate change. It's just the fact that upstream, people take the water and divert it for irrigation, for whatever things. So it's always a combination. It's not a kind of clear-cut black and white picture. Well, if you see the last picture there, you can still that there is a bit more water than it used to be. That's the last was taken in 2017. Well, people are diverting a bit less water. And, then you have a bit more water going into the lake. What's happening there is right now, it's the international donors, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others are talking about a 50 billion project trying to build a canal to bring water which used to be diverted to make it to the Lake Chad. Is that going to happen? I have no idea. 50 billion, it's a big money. Even if we come up out of the session where we talked about trillions and quadrillions, so, billions might seem small. However, in the climate change and the real economy domain, billions are still kind of big money. And the 10 million people who are basically living in the basins are fully depending in terms of survival. Well, what's going to happen with them? But obviously, they are not the ones who are taking the decision. Anyway, someone hinted in an earlier presentation, what we can really see. And if you see here, the pointer, here, what you see here in red is basically what we call geophysical events. Geophysical events is basically tsunami, seismic activities, earthquake, volcanoes. Yeah. So far, we consider that humans, we don't have much impact on these events. Well, there is still a debate because the fracking activity linked to shale gas, etc., and oil, new forms of unconventional forms of oil are supposedly in Canada and West US influencing seismic activity. But still, this is debatable. What is not debatable is this, which is basically what we call meteorological events or hydrological events, which basically landslides, floods, storms. And well, the data, and that's important, this comes from the reinsurance business. You know, reinsurance business, obviously, it's important, it's big business, and very worried about what's happening with the climate change issues, because basically their main question is what becomes insurable and what becomes uninsurable in today's and particularly tomorrow world. And as you can see, these trends are decoupling. And you have a clear, and if you look at, I just looked at the figures for the very recent year, it's continuing to be consistently that. So the question is, what do you do? But, so how do you get there? So I go from events to a kind of bigger picture, and if you put everything together, well, it's no surprise that, you know, we had what we call an acceleration of development. Basically, changes which were happening over 10,000 years started to happen over 1,000 years, and then 100 years, and then 10 years. So you see when you talk about the blockchain, which was 10 years ago, or the internet a bit more, but we are talking about dozens or couple of dozens years. So the changes we are basically bringing into the Earth, they are sufficiently to compete with basically geology. And just to give you examples, obviously, you know, population, we know that in the last couple of 100 years, we have this trend. And it's, even if it's a kind of, the slope is getting smaller, however, this, so far, it's continuing. And as one of the previous speakers was saying, well, population, it's always the kind of big elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about population because putting a cap of population means a lot of moral, ethical issues for many people. So that's a kind of, we don't want to touch that. Nitrogen cycle, nitrogen, you know, it's, we are, I mean, much of the body, human body and animal body is nitrogen. So there is a natural cycle of, you know, fixations of nitrogen. However, what happened in the last 4 or 5 decades is the fact that the nitrogen is getting really, the nitrogen created by humans, what we call the anthropogenic one, which is up here, it's getting much higher than the one which is in the stabilization cycle of the nature. Well, extinction of species, and you name them. Well, you know, one of the things people tried, you know, to try to put that in a kind of bigger perspective, and some of you might be familiar with that framing, which is what we call planetary boundary. Planetary boundaries, what are the processes which basically taken together can keep us as a species, us as population on Earth within some safety limits. And we call them planetary boundaries. There are 9 of them. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but the main message here is that basically the 4 of these planetary boundaries, climate change, genetic diversity, nitrogen cycle, I just discussed that, and land use change are already crossing. And you see, if you see the color code there, if it's green, we are kind of safe. I mean, fresh water, we know there is strain on fresh water. However, we still know how to manage that. We will see for how long. However, there are some of the dimensions which went into the yellow and even the red. And again, I'm not saying it is the only way to think about. I'm not saying that absolutely all the dimensions are there, but this is a kind of framing which is helping people to understand how, and obviously this dimension, they interact with each other. It's not like I just keep one under control, done, tick the box, go to the next. So that's something, so that's, we talked about the problem, and you know, basically, we know that if we want to tackle climate change, we have to go to the emissions. The emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, And this is, if you see on this chart, which was actually put together by the World Resource Institute, and I like this one, it's an interactive one you can play with if you want, but you can see you have all emissions there, but then when you go, you have the top 10 emitters, and then they are by country, and then they are by sectors. Well, in a nutshell, top emitters, you know, China, US, Brazil, EU altogether, etc. That's not a big surprise, everybody knows. Sectors, again, it's not a big surprise. Energy, it's a big, big chunk there. Then you have agriculture, you have industrial processes. But basically, my point is, if you want to use technology or whatever else, you have to go into these big chunks. If you don't go there, you don't advance too much. So if we go just one step further, you know, how these emissions, they go more into the details. Basically, you know, you have the big chunks, power station, agriculture, transport, built environment. So this is there. What you have on the top diagram, it's all the emissions altogether. When we talk about emissions, we always talk about CO2, but actually what we talk about is CO2 equivalent, which means whatever is emitted, we transform it into carbon dioxide equivalent, so to make things a bit more simple when we talk about. But in fact, you are going to have oxide of nitrates, sulfur oxide, methane, and you name it. But to make things simple, we keep it at that level. However, what is interesting is to see that, you know, if you look in CO2 per se, this is the little graph down there, you have more or less the same thing. You know, the same sectors are there. However, if you think of methane, for example, well, agriculture is a big producer of methane, because that's basically cattle and some of the industrial, the agricultural processes. Nitrous oxide, it's actually, again, is agriculture and land use change. So it's, and why I'm talking about that, if you tackle the issue of methane, even if it's a smaller issue compared to the big ones, the power of some of the gases is much higher than the CO2. So in terms of, so you have to think either about big quantities or about small quantities but of powerful emitters. So what's happening? Well, you know, things are happening, of course. I'm sure everybody knows in this room that in 2015 we signed an agreement which is called the Paris Climate Agreement. And basically the idea was to say, okay, let's keep the planet on track and try to go to less than 2 degrees Celsius. When we talk about 2 degrees Celsius, that's always compared to the pre-industrial level. What we also need to know is that basically 1 degree, we already have it. We produced it in the last basically 100 years, sorry. And also one of the other points was to say, well, you know, let's also try to go even lower, which is 1.5 degrees. That's a political trick in some way, because basically it's the small nations, small island states, which brought that into the perspective, saying, hey guys, if for us 2 degrees is far too big, at 1.5 degree, we have a chance to still survive. At 2.2 degrees, we are all underwater. So your deals are not for us. So let's try to do better. What is also interesting about this framing is that it's the first time, you know, Kyoto Protocol was signed long ago. It was binding, which means every country committed to do so. Well, not much happened, and nevertheless, even if it was binding. This time, the approach was different. It was saying, hey, countries, government, please pledge what you think it makes sense in terms of intended reduction of your emissions. Let's put that all together and see if it fits the bill of the 2 degrees, which is not exactly on track, but then let's make jointly more efforts and see how we can move on this one. So it's quite interesting because also it was a call for non-state actors. And it's the first time, you know, at this kind of UN-ish level to start having this something else which is big businesses, civil societies, communities, city mayors, and so on. So that's one thing. Also, something which was commissioned back then was the fact that the IPCC Special Report 1.5 was also commissioned exactly for the reason I explained earlier, and saying, well, you know, and actually, as a matter of fact, the results were released 2 weeks ago in Incheon, a few kilometers from here, and basically saying, well, if we really want to stay on track of the 1.5 degrees, we better get going, and we have to take action at an unprecedented scale. Well, it's not a very engaging language, but actually this is what is needed. So, you know, instead of just saying something which is wishy-washy, you better say things as they are. So that's one thing, because we are in Seoul, and I don't know how many of you know, but 8 years ago, in 2010, there is something which is called the GGGI, the Global Green Growth Institute, which is sitting a couple of kilometers here in Seoul. And it's an intergovernmental organization which is trying to think about inclusive and green development for the developing countries. So, I mean, South Korea, frankly, it's a very good place to think about these issues, because a lot of things are trying to happen. And last point, I mean, and this is in agreement with what I was saying about the Paris Climate Agreement, is the fact that the entrepreneurs around the world, they are doing a lot, and you have a lot of climate innovation at very different scale, and really, you know, bottom-up, big businesses, hackathons, startups, you name it, universities, civil society actors. So, I mean, there are a lot of things happening. One more thing in terms of framing, again, this was mentioned very, very briefly in the previous session. We have this also this framing, which is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to go into that. What is important to think about is that this is providing, and this was also signed in 2015 and adopted by the General Assembly of the UN, it's providing a framing of action for both developed and developing countries to take action. And actually quite a number of companies, governments, regions, cities, they basically, when they think about their sustainable development strategy, they try to see how that connects with these bigger goals. Well, why I'm talking also about the SDGs here is because 6 of the 17, and I circled them in red there, I squared them rather than circle, actually, but are basically directly linked to environment and to the human influence on the environment. So, as I said, you know, that's the problem, that's the framing. So now, what's happening? And again, you know, as I said, we'll need revolutionary thing, but let's go first into what's happening, and again, what's happening in the big sectors, and the sectors where the emissions, most of the emissions come from. Energy, agriculture, land use change, industry, because this is, if you have actions happening there, you can already, with what is existing in terms of technology, you can deliver quite a lot. So in energy sector, well, one of the good news is that tipping point for renewable is there. Developing countries, developed countries, that's definitely there. It's there to stay, and I don't think it's going to be any comeback from the renewables. And you have all kinds of forms. You have shared energy forms, very distributed. You have some small scale off-grid solar for kind of remote places happening quite a lot. Energy storage capacities, also that's being developed. Carbon capture and storage, I'm going to come to that because that's a more kind of contested story. And, well, smart grids, when you put so much renewables and instability, you have to do something with your grid. If not, you get into real trouble. So IoT, Internet of Things, and other technologies are really, digital technologies are helping to make this grids stable, reliable, smart, we call them, and we try also to make them cheaper, okay? So that's in energy. Agriculture, and again, I'm not gonna go over everything, just I'm gonna pick a few things here and there. Precise agriculture, that's something which we talk more and more about. Precise agriculture, smart agriculture, which means what kind of crop I can plant, where, and how can I put a bit of pesticides. I mean, we all like organic, but you know, sometimes people just do use pesticide and fertilizer, but how you cannot overdo it. So this kind of precise kind of agriculture. Efficient seeds, particularly for the vulnerable places in the world, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, which is getting even more desertified, South Asia. Something is really interesting, a lot is going on what we call silvopasture. That's since ages, you know, that's in how it always worked, and it's basically just mixing pasture with trees. But this is a kind of, became a kind of big hype, and technology is helping actually, how to combine what kind of species, to put them together so you get the best of conservation, and also in the same things, you know, cattle or whatever kind of going on. Built environment, very big issue. You know, I mean, in Korea, if I'm not mistaken, for a country of a bit over 50 million inhabitants, 25 million are more or less within the metropolitan Seoul. Well, that's a big part of the chunk of urban, and that's the case for most of the world, developed world, but also more and more developing world. So what's happening in urban is really important. Built environment needs to become green. And there are a lot of things. There are very trivial things like energy retrofit. That's no, you know, not very sexy to talk about, but still you need to do it. Automated building maintenance, all kind of things. There are all kind of cool things happening. The rooftop solars, vertical farming. This is something which is happening more and more in cities because people try to bring production of food within the cities themselves. So that's a lot happening there, but again, technologies like the digital one can help a lot, and they do. And also what in land use change, the biggest problem is deforestation. Deforestation, either to illegal logging, you know, or to crops for agriculture, I'm sure you know, transforming that into tropical forests, which get converted into palm plantation to get palm oil, or just because it becomes urbanized space. And a lot of technologies actually can work there. Detecting when it's starting to be illegal logging, that kind of things. It's actually, again, it doesn't look very tech, but actually it's very effective. Transport, well, electric vehicle, obviously taking also picking, both in developing and developed countries. Then you have hydrogen fuel cell. Well, there are a few commercialized. That's not much yet on the market. It might get there or not. Some of them solar panel fuel vehicles. But for me, the biggest point in transport is the coupling of transport with energy production, which means if you have electric vehicles, and when I say electric vehicles, it could be trucks, it could be public transport, it could be personal cars, you couple that with the production of renewables, which means the cars or the vehicles, they become storage. And you couple that in a way that you don't need to have storage of energy somewhere, but you do it in a smart way, so when the wind blows or the sun is up, you can do more of this. Industry, well, a lot of things, but, well, one point, you know, because that's something, a kind of the nice story everybody tells, the Montreal Protocol, refrigeration. You know, refrigeration, we won the battle of the Montreal Protocol, phasing out the CFCs and the HCFCs, which were producing ozone depletion. Now we replace that stuff, but something else, which indeed doesn't cause ozone depletion anymore. However, it's a very big emitter of of emissions, globally speaking. So we have to do something with that. And, you know, the way we cool even that room, or, you know, AC in your car or in your apartment or in your fridge, it's still that way. So we have to do something with that. Again, it might not seem to be the most glamorous problem to solve. However, it's a big one. One of the big issues on which we consume a lot of energy in the world is cooling. Cooling houses, cooling cars, cooling a nuclear power plant, keeping food safe in refrigerated areas. So that's a really, really big issue. Then we go to more, I would not call them traditional anymore because, you know, quantum computing, but of course, you know, quantum computing, we have been waiting for a long time to have quantum computing to go and to develop. We might get something one day, but, you know, and there are a lot of hopes in terms of new sources of energy or new types of material for construction, for example. Well, CCS, carbon capture and storage technologies, and we go from there, which could be very small scale or very big scale. Very big scale is, it goes into solar radiation management, which is what we call big term geoengineering, which is basically playing quote unquote with the Earth to see how we can keep it cooler. There are a number of things, you know, injecting particles into the stratosphere, trying to change the color of the clouds, and so on. That's on the paper or in the lab. Nobody dared yet to go, you know, full scale, because the problem is also we don't know yet what would be the unintended consequences of some such things. So basically, you know, artificial trees, you have a lot of experiments around the world. You know, this up there, they are the ones which are in Singapore. I mean, what we call artificial trees, they are supposed to suck CO2 from the atmosphere, while in Singapore they have other roles, aesthetics plus capturing water condensation plus, you know, providing shade and so on, and also showing the world that we are quite sophisticated in terms of technology, so you have all this kind of in one. Well, solar radiation management, again, we have to be a bit careful. So we'll see, you know. But there are many big businesses actually pushing for geoengineering to happen, saying, well, you know, in any case, we are going to have to take out the carbon which is already in the atmosphere, so we should get it. Well, so finally, AI, and moreover, the digital technology. Can we talk about, you know, AI for the planet, AI for the good? You know, we talked over the last 2 days about this fourth industrial revolution. Can we think about the fourth industrial revolution for the planet or for the Earth? So, beyond productivity gain, beyond efficiency gains, definitely AI and other digital technology are really permeating all industries. So they're changing beyond the fact that you get a couple of percentage in terms of productivity. And it's undeniable that we can advance, and we do advance, conservation, knowledge in terms of environment, eco-efficiency, on a number of issues. Well, I don't know if you are aware, but now there is also something we call the AI for Good Summit. This year in Geneva, earlier this year, second summit happened and basically was taking the framework of the SDGs and trying to see how together thinking, AI innovators, pioneers, champions, taking them together with sustainability plus policymakers, decision makers in corporations and saying, well, can we do AI for the planet? Well, AI for the planet, you can do many things. You can do incremental things and you can do breakthrough things. Well, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, water, fresh water, clean air, you name it, weather, etc. I'm not going to go into all of this. I'm just going to pick a few examples, you know. First thing, climate model. You know, we do a lot of climate modeling, IPCC. You know, we also come up, and this is how you come up with predictions in terms of 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, more, etc. What are the consequences at 100 years, 50 years, and so. AI can definitely improve, and machine learning can improve this kind of modeling. You can optimize forecasting of the energy systems. You can organize virtual power plants. You can organize virtual water. You can kind of make leaner manufacturing supply chain. You can have on-demand transport, mobility, the autonomous car that was discussed quite a lot yesterday. Again, agriculture, we discussed the precise agriculture and, you know, crop production, precision agriculture, nutrition, and you name it. So yes, a lot is happening, and, you know, they can address all of these dimensions: the power, the energy, which, as we discussed, the transport, the production, consumption, the agriculture, and the cities. So all of this can be done. A lot of it is actually being done. So if you think, you know, in terms of timeline, actually a lot of things is happening even today. And this is a kind of reasonable timeline for the next 2 decades. To have, you know, and I'm not talking about kind of breakthrough things like artificial photosynthesis, which are also in the lab, but there are things which are there, you know, on-demand electric vehicles, and how they are getting connected with, as I said, you know, renewables and so on. So I would say this is a good prospect. However, the question is, and that's basically, I would say, the biggest challenge for the digital big tech sectors. Can the digital sector help the world going from something, you know, a lot is being done, but it's not enough in terms of scale, and it's not done fast enough. So if we take it at a higher scale and faster, so an acceleration is needed. So this is why I'm taking, can the digital sector kind of accelerate? Go from an incremental perspective to a more transformational action in terms of climate change. And a lot of things are happening. Again, you know, if you look at the big guys in you know, the giant stacks, you have a very nice fund of 1 billion. And again, 1 billion might be not big, but it's still big enough. You can do a lot of things with 1 billion. A few billionaires from the tech sector, they got together, and they fund what we call the Breakthrough Energy Venture, very interesting projects being funded. Okay, that's my advanced something. You have, you know, giants like Apple saying, oh, 100% of my supply chain is gonna be circular economy, and so on. So a lot of these commitments are being done. Some of them, they are slowed down, however, they exist. But frankly, even if you do that, definitely it doesn't fit the bill. The bill is too big. So, you know, if you take basically the emissions coming from this sector, you are in a couple of percent. You know, that's, if you take the data centers and so on, you add a bit more, but still. So I would say, I would argue that the biggest change which can be done by the digital tech giant is in the interface with consumers and with citizens. The big systems you all use, I understood that in Korea the system is called Kakao, which is it's not WeChat, it's not necessarily Facebook, but others. So basically you have billions of interface every day. So can you change behavior? Well, some of the behaviors actually of consumers and of citizens already changed. Well, do they change in the right direction? And the question becomes moral or ethical. Who are we to say what's the right direction, you know? Can we go into more stability, sustainability or not? So technology, as I said, it's great, it's there. We need what is there and more, and breakthrough which are in the pipe. But again, this is not going to change the bill if we don't address also the family planning. We heard yesterday, you know, about educating girls, moving diets towards more plant-rich diets, food waste. Well, food waste, that's even a kind of palatable problem. And a lot is happening, and a lot is happening via gamification. I've seen a lot of interesting experiences in the world. But again, the question of scale is still there. And you know, we all speculate about artificial intelligence being the kind of wild card in making, the transition towards a sustainable world? Well, again, do we do what we did already 25 years ago, waiting too much from AI and from the other digital technologies? Are we exaggerating the value? Are we minimizing the dangers? But, because as we discussed, there are a lot of things to come out of AI and very good things in terms of opportunities for a sustainable world. However, AI can also help extraction of natural resources. We talk about extraction of mineral from the deep ocean via robots and AI, etc. So that's more environmental disturbance. It could push even further the consumerism. We have enough of it, at least in my opinion, but we can have more. So that's something also which it's there. It's definitely destabilizing already employment and the forms of employment. And it can definitely empower even more big businesses and even some of the military states. We talk a lot about autonomous, fully autonomous weapons, which take decision by themselves. That's a very contested issues. There are all kind of, debates and big positions there. But we really need to think the why and how AI can or cannot transform basically the environmental governance. Just to give a very quick example here. I mean, this has nothing, not much at least, to do with AI. I'm sure you know the free-floating bike schemes. I've seen that some of them, they exist also here in Seoul. Well, this started in 2015 in Shanghai as a very nice, value-oriented initiative, sustainability-driven, saying, okay, let's bring the Chinese population back to biking. We used to do that. We don't do that anymore. Let's make sustainable bike, which means durable, really good products, and so on. Anyways, to make it very short, well, it seemed like such a good idea that all venture capitalists jumped on the opportunity. And what we ended up, it's this, which means cities in China, and not only, we learn as we go, started having completely clogged public spaces, and Chinese government in a number of the cities, that's work we've done, since 2015 with my research group in Oxford, and we try to understand what's happening on the government side, on the business side, on the venture capitalist side, and so on. But basically, at some point, the Chinese local government just took 500,000 bikes from the street and put them in the garbage can. So what was of intention, a very nice sustainability-driven initiative, became a kind of environmental disaster. I'm not at all against the free-floating bike scheme. I think they are great. However, you need to really foster, co-creation, co-governance, and all the codes around it. If not, it goes bonkers. And now you have schemes which work reasonably well in a number of cities in the world. Anyways, you have more than 200 cities who are getting there. So I'm talking about AI and this little example saying, sometimes you have very, very good ideas and intentions, but it doesn't turn very well in the end. So I'd say it's really time to put AI to work for the planet. Technologies are connected, we know. Biological, physical, digital, it's all there. A lot is happening. We have shifts which already happened, societal shifts which are triggered by technologies. We know that happened. And how to make this going into, I would say, right direction, again. Who is deciding what the right direction is, but to go into the sustainability. And this kind of transformation, well, it doesn't happen automatically. It can happen, but also it can go, transformation happen, but they have many unintended consequences and very transformational action, it's never done by design. You always have things happening, coalescing, and then you have unintended consequences. So basically, you have to have a conversation between all the actors of the societies. But I would say it's an exciting time for all these digital technologies to put them together at the service of the good. And my last slide, and my final kind of guide of conclusions, I would say we need to go from, if you think what happened in the digital space with the Moore's law. Moore's law was followed and kept pace. So many technology actors kept pace with the Moore's law for quite a number of remarkable years. So I would say we need to move from Moore's law to the Carbon's law, which, we know, as a matter of fact, that we have to halve emissions every decade. Well, the first bit, and I explained that earlier, we can do it a lot with very traditional technologies. It's there. It might be not very glamorous. However, you have to do incremental plus transformational. It's not because transformational things have to happen that you should just forget about, the kind of due work which is maybe less glamorous. But can we get inspiration in how to trigger this transformation from the way technology companies, they build alliances and they try to keep pace with the Moore's law? And we need to harness this technological innovation, but to bring all the other bits. Governance, stakeholders, financiers, and financiers, when I'm not talking about funding. Funding sometimes is too much funding. So, the kind of right schemes for funding. So basically, and the biggest thing is what's happening in the changing of the behaviors. And watch that, have a kind of compass and watch out what's happening and how unintended consequences, which are going to be there, of course, how we can get out of this and, prepare for the shifts and the new, how we can have a kind of, roadmap, but a positive roadmap. What I really don't like in this climate change sphere is that everybody talks about very bleak visions. It's bleak, it's doom, it's fear-like and fear-oriented. I would say there is so much opportunity. When I teach my students in Oxford or elsewhere, I don't have any envy to go into the room and say, hey guys, we are doomed, because I don't believe it. If not, I would change my job anyway. But there are positive narratives and, how to do empowering, how to do something which is inspiring. I think that's one of the most important things which has to happen. Thank you very much.